Good evening, and welcome to another edition of the Dog Walk. I believe this will be number 4. Although, to be fair, I still think this is mostly practice. A lot of my thought, I'm still figuring out the format. I haven't organized my thoughts in advance as well as I would like to. And I'm just really considering this still as practice. So, with that said, that means that obviously any feedback is greatly appreciated. Which brings me to the topic that I thought I would talk about today, which is kind of why I'm doing this in very broad terms. So, I was actually thinking about this because I was, again, just now asking for feedback, right? But feedback from whom? Right? Who am I actually doing this? And I know I've said at the start that I'm mostly doing this, for my son and to kind of think about and discuss the things that I would want him to know. But obviously, since I am putting this out there, I'm also hoping that maybe I'll reach a few others out there who could possibly benefit from what I have to say. Whether they agree or disagree with me, if they're willing to listen, that's great. But if I want to be really honest, I think I have to say that the big reason why I'm doing this is for myself. I'm getting older, and I feel that, don't get me wrong, I am not comparing myself to any of the, the Nietzsches or the Teslas or the Socrates or this or that of this world. Never will. But I do think that over my 4 years I have had some interesting and possibly novel thoughts that I would think are worth exploring. But the big problem is that I have so many interests and things that occupy my time that I never seem to pursue those ideas to their conclusion, I'll say. So, yeah, I think that I have forgotten already so many great ideas that I would have, or thoughts, I should say, rather than ideas, that I would have liked to be able to explore eventually. I'd like to start to record them so that perhaps one day in the future, when I have more time to myself, I can go back to these thoughts that I might have had and, push a little bit further if I didn't have the time to do so. So that's also one of the main reasons, a big reason why I'm doing this. So with that little intro out of the way, I guess I can speak a little bit about where or some of my background. Sorry, again, right? Just starting out, thoughts not fully organized. I, thought about what topic I wanted to discuss maybe 5 minutes before I came out, as I was starting to get dressed. So I don't really have a game plan, unfortunately, which is one of the things, like I said, I'd like to remedy eventually. If this becomes a little more serious or more organized when I have more time. So anyway, what I wanted to say is, I ideas in too many domains, or I have too many interests, and I found that by, how do I say, basically by being more general and by trying to go over the fence to see different things that might not necessarily seem to connect at first glance, I think you can get novel ideas, a better understanding of other points of view, and I think it's to your benefit. I know I'm not being very eloquent right now. I'm trying to gather my thoughts as I was speaking, which I'm finding is a little bit harder than normal, because in a conversation, you get a pause, you get some feedback, you reorganize, regroup, focus on a specific point at a time, which clearly in a monologue is not the case. So, anyway, so what are the format that I had said is I wanted to speak a little bit about myself every video, right? So I'll go and explain what I mean by versatile by throwing out a few examples. Let's say, for example, music. Well, I say the band, I think the band that I've probably listened to the most in my entire life, if not Metallica or Children of Bottom, which are two metal bands, it's probably No Effects or something like that. Yeah, No Effects, because I listened to them almost exclusively throughout all of high school. No Effects is a punk band, so already metal punk. You're gonna say, well, that's similar. It's not as similar as you would think, but what if I told you that on the same playlist as I have these metal and punk bands, I also have some Stevie Ray Vaughan, some B.B. King, some Rachmaninoff, some Bartok, Mozart, obviously, Bruce Springsteen. I got listened to my fair share of EDM, a few classic, very classic. I like the classic era of rap, like really, really old school, like Rappers Delight and that type of really old school, that type of stuff. I listen to basically every kind of music. The only real, even I would say usually this is where I would say except for country, but I found that as I grow older, I've even been able to find some appreciation for that type of music. So I wouldn't say that I am a super fan and that I would go to a rap concert, but I never in high school would have been caught dead listening to a boy band or popular music, Backstreet Boys or anything like that. Yet, I had a great time at the Lady Gaga concert, right? Was it as good as a Linkin Park concert? Well, probably not. But anyway, that's just an example. So I like most styles of music. What I prefer actually in music, just to throw it out there, is a complexity. That's why at the top for me is, in order, metal, classical, and jazz, and then the rest come. But yeah, anyway. But I did learn to play instruments. I have a nice guitar downstairs that I haven't played for a little bit, but do my interests stop there? No. As I've mentioned before, sports. I was very active when I was a kid. I was pretty good at pretty much any sport that I would play. I was lucky like that. Varsity team at a university, all that type of stuff. national team in martial arts when I was younger, snowboard instructor when I was 16. So you've got the music, you've got the sports, right? But I spent as much time when I was in high school playing Dungeons and Dragons and computer games. The first. Yeah, I even remember, Rise of the Triad before Wolfenstein and all that stuff. But anyway, Warcraft 2. So I was a gamer. I was a science guy. I loved to read. I remember winning the charity book reading contest that we had at my school when I was young. More than doubling the quantity of books that the next person had read. Anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that I don't really, I never fit into the jock versus nerd versus. Oh yeah, I was into Wicca for a while. I was into the whole goth scene for a while. I've tried almost everything. Vampire nerd. Anyway, I think you get my point. I won't go much more into that because I feel I've already talked too much about this. My point is that and I haven't even mentioned my primary interest, which as I said previous episodes, is science and engineering, right? That's my actual job. I'm an aerospace engineer. There's a reason for that. I love that stuff. It's what's fascinating to me. So, anyway, that's a bit more about me. And yeah, where I was going with that, I think, or one of the things I was going for that is another message I want to pass on, which sounds weird coming from a military guy, but in my military career, I've noticed, I think that we need more generalists, less generals. And that sounds weird to say, and I don't mean that in the military sense of generals. What I mean by that is I think that too many people go deep into a specific area and basically become the general in that field. And whether that's, when you're talking business or as a CEO or a corporate shark or as a scientist or a researcher who does only research on nanocells for their entire career or whatever it is. That's what I mean by generals. I found that throughout my career in the military, so many problems have already been resolved. The problem is no one speaks to anyone else, and no one is willing to listen to a slightly different perspective or someone else, because they never seem to believe that non-experts or an outside perspective or experience could be applicable or valuable in their to their specific problem or to their issue. I'm trying to think of an anecdote I can actually talk about. Not in the this is all top secrets sense of the word. More in the I don't want to embarrass other people and too many people, and or these are complicated stories related to big engineering projects that require a lot of context to understand. But I'll just say, for example, that when I was in charge of writing technical requirements for Canada's new search and rescue aircraft's mission systems. All technical requirements must be approved by the operational authority. So that's like the pilot, the guy who's normally flying the airplane, and they are the ones who decide what is in and outside of the scope of your project, because they're the operators, right? They're the ones who are going to be doing the missions, so they know what they need, supposedly. Whereas on the other side, as a technical authority, basically your job is to figure out what technical solution will allow you to achieve the operational goal that is set. So, for example, to stay in search and rescue, the pilot, the operational requirement might be to be able to find someone who's in the water, in the ocean, with your sensors from 10 kilometers away. Okay, well then, on the technical side, what that will mean is that, my electro-optic infrared pod will need to have this specific resolution, or how do I say? I'm trying to keep simple terms. Will be like basically the camera lens will need to be this big in order to be able to see as far as the pilot needs to see. So everything that you do is directed by those guys. Well, I kid you not, it was not even possible to get the pilots who were in charge of this project, who were C-130 Hercules pilots, to just talk to the pilots. I'm saying pilots, I mean operators. There's several different trades, but anyway, including airborne sensor operators and all that type of stuff. You couldn't even get them to take 5 minutes to speak to the operators. I'll say operators, that's a more accurate term, and still, anyway, who from our maritime patrol aircraft fleet, whose entire job for the last, since the Second World War, and entire expertise and their only raison d'être, the only reason they exist, is to find stuff in the water. So the guys from the Hertz don't even want to ask them. Maybe, their experience might be useful. They might have something that could be helpful. Or we are trying to implement a more integrated kind of suite for the guy who's actually operating the sensors. And again, the guys who are working on a project, the Herc pilots, they didn't have experience with that because they were flying ordinary aircraft that didn't have the same type of sensors. So again, I was not able to get them to take 5 minutes out of their time, on this multi-billion-dollar project to speak to the fighter jet pilots who are used to being a single person in the cockpit and forced to do everything on themselves and multitasking, and how to optimize, and whose entire again a big thing in their job is how to make the cockpit as efficient as possible so that you can get the information and make the decision before your enemy gets the information and makes his decision, where a literal split second means life and death when you're talking about fighters, right? So anyway, point is that people are too close-minded to even consult, I would say, their peers, right? Let's say you're a pilot in a military aircraft fleet, right? Like wouldn't you say that pilots from another military aircraft fleet are relatively close to your peers? I mean, they might not be flying the exact same thing, but I'm sure you've gone to, like in Canada at least, I know you've gone to the same flight school. If you're talking about our maritime patrol pilots, you went to the same second phase of training too. You probably went to university with some of these guys for 4 years at our military college, right? Like, these are much more your peers than, let's say, the engineers are in the Air Force. But these engineers in the Air Force are much more your peers than the infantry guy in the Army, right? Who's much more closer to being your peer than someone who's not in the military or to the lumberjack. Well, you get my drift, right? So you can't even get one pilot to talk to another pilot. How can you hope? Like, what is the hope to get people to, look at someone else's perspective that's a little bit. How are you gonna get, sorry to say, like the Israeli to talk to the Palestinian? How are you gonna get the Republican to talk to the Democrat and maybe, see that, hey, they have a valid point, when you can't even get people who are 95%, 97%, 99% the same to value the experience and what the other has to say. So this that wasn't the plan, but it seems like I'm always reconnecting back to the original point that I made about in groups and out groups, and I'm just trying to find hope for us because all I'm seeing is the gap widening, confirmation bias. People only go to the sources that they believe in, so they'll never see the other side of the story. Anyway, I just wish more people were generalists, less people were generals. Less people would come in and say, hey, I've flown a Hercules for 30 years. I know how we do search and rescue. Never mind the fact that I flew an aircraft that was actually built in the 60s and who has 0 sensors. That's irrelevant in this technological age because I've flown for 30 years. I know better than everyone else. And nothing that you say, Mr. Pilot from the other fleet, will even come into my mind. It's in one ear, out the other. If I even listen to you sit in the same room, let alone, you little junior engineer, and I'm talking about myself, who's trying to tell me that yes, it's possible to find, people using sensors, because in my experience, using the sensors, like looking through a straw, and that's it, right? Meanwhile, I'm bringing piles and piles and piles of examples of, U.S. Coast Guard finding some dude under an avalanche, or, with their IR pod. He was under the snow. They would never have seen him with their eyes. But anyway, so people go in and based on their single point of view, and without ever wanting to listen, direct. I wish we had more generalists. People who are willing to cross the aisle, cross-pollinate. Sure, you get, concentrate on something, right? Like in my case, concentrate on engineering, or even more specifically in my trade, I'm really my expertise is really in project management and systems engineering on the technological side, I'll say. Well, which is a different specialization from some of my peers who work more in aircraft maintenance operations in the squadrons. But still, I learned a lot from my one tour in the squadron. It did open my eyes a little bit to the value of that expertise. Not that I doubted it, I just think it's very much over exaggerated in my trade, but that's a different conversation for another day. Uh, my point is that, it's good to take that person who's used to being in a field and bring them into the HQ so they can learn a little bit more about why it takes 2 weeks to get that deviation that they ask for, or how busy the AEO actually is. Things would be better if, the Air Force guy spent a bit more time with the Army guy. And I'm using all military examples. I'm realizing now as I'm rambling on that I'm being way too specific. You get my point. What I'm trying to say is, please get the Democrat to talk to the Republican. And when I say talk, I don't mean just talk at. I mean have a conversation and listen. And don't just listen to answer. Listen to try to understand what they're trying to say. If we just have a few more people, we need the specialists. We always need them. There has to be a general somewhere. But if there were a few more people who cross-pollinate and, despite being an engineer, take the time to read Nietzsche. Despite being, I don't know, anyway, you get my drift. I feel I'm rambling on. I got completely off track of what I wanted to say at first, which was, I have some thoughts that I want to try to record also, not just for Felix, not for anyone who would like to provide me any feedback, have a conversation, but also recording for myself so that I can perhaps look more into them later. I should give a few examples of these thoughts. For example, one that I've always wanted to look into is the concept of Planck's constant. And I'll say any constant really, but it all comes down to Planck's constant in my mind. And how do we know that it is constant? Because if it wasn't, and if instead it was proportional, let's say, to the size of the universe at any given time, or something like that, since the Big Bang, that could actually explain a lot of redshift, and maybe even get rid of the need for dark energy and black matter. I don't know. Again, it's a kind of crazy thought that I have that I write down on a napkin and probably forget about and wish that I had time to investigate. Sometimes I feel that, again, that's one of the dangers of being the generalist, and that's why you do need the specialist, is that, sometimes you can know just enough to make yourself dangerous, I'll say. And that's one of the big sayings that they used to have when I learned at the explosive disposal flight, how to get rid of, anyway, whatever, that's beside the point. Where I was going with that is I like to see it like this. If Planck's constant isn't constant, that is, in proportional to time since the Big Bang, well, actually it wouldn't be inversely proportional. I don't know. I have to think about it for a second there. Anyway, wouldn't basically Planck's length changing explain away redshift as light being emitted further back in time, being not necessarily more stretched by the acceleration of the expansion of the universe, but rather by the change in the dimensions by which you measure space-time itself, Therefore, if you would go back, rewind the clock, you would see that, that redshift would actually reverse itself so that the light that was emitted. But anyway, whatever. I'm not doing the thought justice because this is a thought I had 20 years ago. I wrote down somewhere, and I was a lot more familiar with all the concepts back then. And again, I'd have to look it up, but that's the type of thought that I'd like to explore. Or my intro about moral relativism yesterday. Obviously, that's not the whole discussion on my thoughts on the subject. I'm not trying to say that no morality is better or that anything like that. I'm not trying to say Hitler was justified because everything's relative. Yeah, who cares? Not at all. What I was trying to say is that I think it's arrogant to think that any solution that any human mind could come up with, and I would in fact almost probably expand that to AI, would not be biased and would be universal because, as Nietzsche showed, it's from even before we are born, our thought patterns are already influenced by all that has come before us that has shaped our parents and their society and this and that. So before we even start to be conceived, we are biased. Therefore, how can our thought be universal? I don't know. We have limits imposed on us from before we even exist. Anyway, my thoughts don't just stop at the crazy scientific theories, engineering principles, like why has no one built sun collector or solar collectors around the sun that would beam through space, through the Lagrange points, back to Earth, so that you could collect all the energy concentrated. You could create a network throughout the solar system of basically lasers or microwave or whatever we want to use of power that could be shared throughout and power all of space flight within our solar system, along with beaming energy directly to Earth that wouldn't be filtered out by the atmosphere, which means that you would get a lot more bang for your buck per square meter that's blocked. You could or could not, to your choice, block the sunlight coming to Earth, which would then increase or not, blockage of global warming. Anyway, I've got stories, I've got more thoughts, but now it's time to go home. Thanks for listening. Sorry again for the rambling. Have a good night, everyone.